Before we start with this section, I would like to do a recap of what we've learned so far. So far, we've established a theory of consumer behavior, which tells the story of consumers with their motive given by their preference for consumption and constrained by something like their budget, making decisions in the marketplace, which is to go and purchase goods and services in the marketplace. We've also established a theory of producer behavior, where producers, with the motive of making money, sell goods and services in the marketplace, and they face their own constraints like the technology, which establishes how to turn inputs into outputs and eventually determines what it's going to cost to produce those goods and services. And then finally, we've taken those two theories and put them together in what's called equilibrium behavior, which is having a bunch of consumers and a bunch of producers transacting in the marketplace as a result of their rational, motive-based decision making. Now, what these three things have in common is that they respond to what's called positive economics. Positive economics tries to answer the question of what is actually going to happen when we have market transactions. And this section does not deal with that. This section deals with what's called normative economics, which asks a different type of question. It asks, what should happen when we have individuals and firms transacting in the marketplace? It's a very different type of question. And because it asks such a different style of question, we need to establish a criterion in order to be able to say whether an outcome that we observe that's coming from positive economics is desirable for society or maybe not so much. And so what will that criterion be? The criterion that we're going to use is called total social gain. And like its name says, it's the gain to society from having these voluntary transactions take place. But we need to establish how we're going to measure that gain to society. And for that, we're going to use what's called consumer and producer surplus. And I will briefly explain what they are in this video. And in the next few videos, you're going to get a way to measure consumer and producer surplus. And so we're going to determine briefly the relation between social gain and consumer and producer surplus. And then finally, also very briefly, I will define and explain what the role of externalities are. The reason I'm going to do it very briefly is because in this section, we're not going to be worried about externalities, but externalities may show up in future sections. So we need to define what we're talking about. And so let's start as simple as we can. Think of a single voluntary transaction. In a single voluntary transaction, somebody gives something up in exchange for something else. And the parties that are involved in that transaction, we're going to call them the private parties. So any agent that's involved in the transaction is a private party to that transaction. Now, we're interested in market transactions. And so in market transactions, there are two types of parties that we're going to have, at least. One is the buyer, which is the agent that's willing to part ways with money in exchange for a good or service. And we typically call the buyer a consumer. But it doesn't have to be a consumer. Think about a firm that's purchasing inputs. Well, it's still a buyer in the market for the inputs. And then we have what we call a seller, which is the agent that is willing to part ways with the good or service in exchange for the money. And again, typically we call the seller a producer. But again, it doesn't have to be a producer. You could think of individuals as selling their time to firms in exchange for money. So they would be the sellers of what we call labor and receiving money in exchange for the labor services. So it doesn't have to be a producer, the ones that's selling. But again, here we're going to assume that buyers are consumers, sellers our producers. And so the transaction will be voluntary, and this word is important, voluntary, if the following is true. The willingness to pay, think of that as the maximum willingness to pay for whatever the good is that's being transacted by the consumer, that has to be greater than the minimum willingness to get paid by the producer. The lowest amount of money that the producer would be willing to receive for the good that the producer is selling. And so for the transaction to make sense, the willingness to pay by the consumer has to be greater than the willingness to pay by the producer, to get paid by the producer. And then another thing that has to happen is that the transacted price has to be somewhere in the middle. And why? Because that way the consumer gains, because the willingness to pay is higher than the price actually paid, and also the producer gains because the price, which is the amount of money that the producer will receive, is going to be greater than the minimum willingness to get paid. And so if those three things are true, then we have a voluntary transaction taking place in the market. Now, that's for a single voluntary transaction. What happens when you add up all these voluntary transactions that are taking place in the market? Well, we're going to define the total private benefit as the sum of all those willingness to pay, those maximum willingness to pay by all the buyers. And so then we can define the consumer surplus as the difference between that total private benefit, the sum of all those willingness to pay by all these buyers, minus the amount paid, the amount they actually had to pay. And that difference we're going to call the surplus. It's the gain for these consumers from interacting and transacting in the marketplace. And using the same concept, we are going to define the total private cost as the sum of the costs to firms of producing all these goods that are being transacted. So all the costs that firms have to incur. And we're going to define producer surplus as the difference between the amount of money that firms receive for the goods that they sell and the total cost of producing those goods. And so that difference will be the benefit, the net benefit that these producers are going to get. And so then, naturally, we can define the total surplus as the producer surplus, this net benefit for producers, plus the consumer surplus, the net benefit for consumers. Now, before we get to total social gain, there's one more thing that we have to consider, because so far we've only analyzed benefits and costs to the private parties. And the one thing that we have to consider is that maybe it is possible parties that are not the parties that are dealing in the transaction may suffer some costs as a result of this transaction or incur in some sort of benefit. And those things are what we call externalities. And so for any voluntary transaction, we're going to define a positive externality as any benefit that affects parties not involved in the transaction. That's why it's called externality, because these parties are external to the transaction. And negative externality as any cost imposed on parties that are not involved in the transaction. So what are examples of positive and negative externalities? The classic examples of positive externalities is, let's say you have a producer of honey, and in order to produce the honey, the producer needs bees. The bees go pollinate the flowers of the apple trees from a producer of apples, and the honeybee producer sells its honey. There's going to be consumers and this producer of honey that are engaged in transactions of honey, but the apple producer, who's not engaged in the transactions for honey, is receiving a benefit from the existence of the bees that pollinates the flowers of its apple orchard. So that's an example of a positive externality. And then the classic example of a negative externality is CO2 emissions. You have a bunch of firms polluting the air. Who suffers from the air pollution? All consumers, all individuals that are affected by it that may not be purchasing the good that these polluting firms are selling. And so that would be a classic example of a negative externality. And so if we include positive externalities that affect parties that are not involved in the transaction and negative externalities that also affect parties not involved in the transaction, we can finally arrive at the social gain from having these market transactions taking place. The total social gain will simply be the total surplus plus any positive externalities minus any negative externalities. Now, having said that, in this particular section, we're going to concentrate on total surplus, meaning that we're going to assume that there are no externalities taking place, and we'll leave the existence of externalities for future sections. So, to recap, we've presented total social gain as a measure of a society's well-being from having these voluntary market transactions taking place. We've established a way to compute total social gain by using three components: consumer surplus, which is the net benefit to consumers from having these voluntary market transactions take place; producer surplus, the net benefit to producers from having these voluntary transactions take place; and externalities, whether positive or negative, which are costs and benefits to parties that are not involved in the transactions taking place. And so then finally, we just established total social gain as the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus plus any positive externality that comes from these transactions minus any negative externality.